Woodley of Many and Dutton present a simple explanation for the phenomena we observe happening in the world around us. Mankind is becoming stupider. Occam's razor says that the simplest explanation is the best. Many observers blame what's going on or look for salvation in the political realm. That's not going to work if the voters are getting dumber. Some blame social trends such as cultural Marxism and the division of society along the lines of race, sex, gender. Many lines of argument in the contemporary dialogue just don't make sense. A simpler explanation is that more people than ever consider themselves intellectual, but although they may outnumber previous generations of supposed intellectuals, they are far less intelligent. As Nicholas Nassim Taleb says, intellectual yet idiot. The authors introduced their book with the observation that we are not smart enough to continue doing the things we used to do. The Concorde stopped flying. It has been half a century since we went to the moon. Such huge projects required vast teams of smart people and could be jeopardized by a weak individual anywhere down the line. Fewer smart people, more dumb ones, and things fall apart. Although most readers will have a fairly good intuitive notion of what it is, Woodley of Many and Dutton need to start with a rigorous definition of intelligence. It is defined rather than discovered. It is a statistical construct made to represent the intelligence of individuals within a large and representative sample of a population. Researchers did not discover that the average intelligence in North America and Western Europe is 100 and the standard deviation is 15. Rather, they took large samples from this population and defined 100 as the average and 15 as the standard deviation that they found. If we take any large random representative sample of a population, and this picture shows 1,000 dots, each representing one person, we find a broad spectrum of measured intelligence. Here I show 4 random samples, all of which exhibit the same characteristics. They have a central tendency. There are more measurements around the middle, which is 100, than out toward the edges. The nature of the Gaussian curve, the bell curve, which has been imposed on the measurements, dictates that about 2/3 of any representative sample have a measured intelligence between 85 and 115, and 19 out of 20s will be between 70 and 130. Above that it gets fuzzy. About 1 person in 250 has an IQ of 140 or above. About 1 in 2,000 will have an IQ of 150 or above. 170 is 1 in a million. You don't see red dots much to the right of 150 in the randomly generated samples I just showed. Different jobs require different levels of mental ability. Typical jobs for people in lower normal range, measuring between 85 and 100, would be fast food, as truckers, or assemblers. Slightly above average people might work as policemen, firemen, or clerks. Employable people with below normal intelligence might find jobs as guards, elder care workers, or child care workers. And at the other end, people in the top 1/6 of the intelligence distribution will typically work as engineers, programmers, or teachers. The top tail of the distribution includes people who could do anything: doctors, lawyers, professors, and chief executives, and so on. Conversely, people with below 70 have a hard time finding anything meaningful to do in modern society. Though it is something we're reluctant to talk about, different societies have different average intelligences. We can mention the smart ones, Japanese, Chinese, and Koreans. There we find a lot of engineers and programmers. Conversely, there are many societies in the world in which there simply aren't enough capable people to form cadres of engineers and programmers. Smart people in those societies are hard-pressed just to maintain a modern infrastructure. The least capable societies in the world simply have a hard time getting anything done. This graph shows the distribution of talent in a country where the average IQ is 70. Note that these societies have to fill most of the same roles as the more developed countries. They simply do it with less intelligent people, and the results are predictably poorer. Europe is now receiving a number of immigrants from a group of countries where researchers Richard Lynn and Tatu van Heenen find average intelligence to be approximately 70, as shown here. A look at how things work in less developed countries provides a pretty good portent of how things will look in our own countries. Actually worse, because we won't have other rich countries to lend assistance when things start to fail. This book presents a variety of forecasts predicting a drop in intelligence of between 1/2 and 1 standard deviation over the next century. If true, this would put us back into the company of developing nations. We would still define our average intelligence to be 100. This standard applies to North American and European populations at the current point of time, whatever that point may be. Woodley of Many and Dutton's thesis is that 100 today may be equivalent to 85 of a century ago, and maybe 115 of a century to come. We are losing ground. Woodley of Many and Dutton's thesis is that the genetically substantive component of human intelligence, namely general intelligence, of that core aspect of intelligence of which all tests of cognitive ability collectively and commonly measure, rose rather dramatically up until the Industrial Revolution and has been falling since. They pursue several avenues to make their case. The first they make is that general intelligence within a population can and does change quickly. Evolution is not the glacially slow process that most imagine. Since IQ tests date back only to the first decade of the 20th century, the authors have to use proxies to estimate general intelligence levels in earlier eras. They use levels of literacy, which are fairly easy to establish, sophistication of word usage and printed material. You can search on WordSum Check to see what it is and to check your own IQ. The correlation between estate size and the number of heirs. Richer people are smarter. Up until the Industrial Revolution, they left more children. Now they don't. The constant decrease in phenomena associated with low levels of intelligence, crime and capital punishment. Polygenic scores for IQ and educational attainment, with modern genomes being richer in the relevant genetic variants when compared to populations from the Bronze and Iron Ages 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, indicate that intelligence is rising. There are several longitudinal, that is, spanning significant periods of time, measures that also suggest that general intelligence has been declining. The National Longitudinal Study of Youth, NLSY, and the PISA tests of educational attainment provide fairly stable intergenerational comparisons. The SAT and ACT tests, proxies for general intelligence, have been recentered downwards several times over the years to accommodate declining student ability. Simple reaction time, that is, time just to react with no choice involved, also correlates with general intelligence. Although the correlation at the level of individual people is low, at the level of populations it's a reliable indicator. Reaction speed is potentially measurement invariant, which means that what it measures, central nervous system efficiency, doesn't drift when different cohorts are compared with one another over time. We can therefore have faith in measurements taken a century ago. They show that our simple reaction time speed has slowed, suggesting a decrease in general intelligence possibly approaching 1 standard deviation, or 15 IQ points, in a century. Performance on working memory measures shows a similar propensity toward decline over the past 80 years. Many intelligence researchers noted during the latter third of the 20th century that measured intelligence seemed to rise. This became known as the Flynn effect for the researcher who dedicated the most effort to studying it. Woodley of Many and Dutton offer a very comprehensive explanation of this perplexing observation. It boils down to the fact that society as a whole has become more technological, and test takers have become more comfortable with the kinds of questions asked. It's an artifact of the testing process, most especially Raven's progressive matrices, and not an indication of a gain in intelligence. James Flynn himself agrees with them. An important element of Woodley of Many and Dutton's thesis is that human intelligence has changed very rapidly and is in the process of changing rapidly right now. It's not the glacial process that most imagine. A reflection of how our intelligence has expanded since our split from our ape ancestors about 7 million years ago is in order. We needed to be smarter to grapple with the environment we were changing, first with tools and fire, and then with speech. The rate of our brain growth between chimpanzees and Lucy, or Australopithecus, was rapid by any historical measure. However, the explosion up to our exodus from Africa was without precedent. It is impressive in absolute size. In terms of the rate of change per generation, it's amazing, a 30-fold increase. Woodley of Many and Dutton offer a hint that this is only the tip of the iceberg. A small sample of London skulls from a millennium ago suggests that our brain size has grown 10 cubic centimeters over that time. If you extrapolate that acceleration into the graph you now see, it would splash clear across the bottom of the page, 10 times more than the phenomenal growth up to 50,000 years ago. The subject of true genius fascinates the authors. Everyday definitions of genius would apply the label to anybody with an IQ above some cutoff, usually 140 or 160 or such. These authors' interest is in truly extraordinary individuals, such as Sir Isaac Newton and Einstein. The book would be richer if their list were longer. To Woodley and Many of Dutton, genius is defined by temperament as well as intellect. Einstein and Newton had the ability to shut out the rest of the world as they focused on their theories. They were rather antisocial. Within my lifetime, we've seen John von Neumann, as quirky as any of the above, Robert Trivers, and Richard Feynman. In earlier eras, certainly Fibonacci, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, some of the Bernoulli family, Pascal, Euler, and Carl Friedrich Gauss would qualify. Incidentally, Peter Bernstein provides wonderful thumbnail biographies savoring the quirks of these people in his book Against the Gods. Woodley of Many and Dutton's thesis is twofold. First, the innovations made by true geniuses enrich the entire society, whether or not they grace the population with any of their own offspring. And number two, geniuses are becoming more rare, in part because of selection against general intelligence. Without a doubt, Laplace, Gauss, and Newton's mathematics enabled Faraday and Maxwell's work with electricity, which has incalculably enriched our society. Atomic power, the bequest to the last generation of true geniuses, has been of more questionable benefit. There were geniuses involved in the early days of the computer, von Neumann among them, and it took some level of genius to invent and continually improve the semiconductor. Overall, however, one has to concede the author's case that there are not as many geniuses today as in previous eras. Why is general intelligence falling? The explanations are simple and obvious. Smart people are not having children, and the developed countries of Europe and North America are being diluted by large numbers of immigrants of lower ability. We are not having children because, number one, we've spent more than a century perfecting ways to avoid them, which, number two, smart people are better at employing. So, Number 3, no longer heeding the call of religion to be fruitful and multiply, we don't. Number 4, we have normalized a panoply of sexual practices that do not lead to procreation. And number 5, smart people find many other pursuits more interesting than raising children and perhaps even sex. It's the dumber people who remain religious, don't know how to avoid conception, and don't have anything better to do with their lives that have children. The trends of defining fertility among the more intelligent and the wholesale importation of less intelligent people into developed countries are becoming more pronounced. The authors offer several predictions of a decline on the order of 5 to 10 points of IQ over the next century. As I write this, the Centers for Disease Control reported that the total fertility rate in America in large metropolitan areas had declined over 18% just over the last 11 years, to a total of just over 1.5 children per woman. 40% of births are out of wedlock, corroborating Woodley of Many and Dutton's thesis that they are not being born to the best and brightest. 90 years ago, in The Decline of the West, Oswald Spengler wrote that civilizations go through cycles. He traced Greece, Rome, China, Islam, and now the West through their winter, spring, summer, and fall. Woodley of Many and Dutton show the ways in which Spengler's predictions for the West are being borne out, and conclude that we have cycled back into winter. What to do? Religion would be attractive, but we cannot force ourselves to believe. Eugenics programs to breed more smart people would be attractive also, but they would go against our principles of equality, free choice, and morality. We simply can't do that. The authors wantonly propose that we grin and bear it, accept the inevitable. A cheerful prescription of countermeasures might sell more books, but the conclusion they draw is absolutely in keeping with the book's argument and what we know of human nature. I, the reviewer, have chosen a backward, homogeneous, that is traditional, Eastern European country in which to raise a second family. Raising children in a society that still values children and respects its own culture seems like the best way to beat the odds. In closing, I'd like to introduce the founder effect meme. We appear headed for a population bottleneck, as white people in general, and smart ones in particular, simply refuse to reproduce. Children of those who do will form a relatively small cohort. In the past, fortune has favored those small cohorts, survivors of the Black Plague and World War I, then the children of the Depression. The smaller generation can be nimble, setting new directions for social trends. With ominous clouds hanging over the economy, pensions, and demographics, it's evident that new directions will be required. It would seem to favor the scions of those in this bleak generation who would accept the challenge of passing on their genes and culture. So returning to the book, I have to say it's a 5-star effort, uniting, as it does, so many streams of thought into a coherent and compelling story.